Hello and thank you for watching. I just thought I would show you a relatively quick edit of a photograph I took earlier last month of two black grouse fighting in their lek in Finland earlier in April. But more specifically, to show you a very useful feature which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with within Lightroom, a mask setting being select subject. I've used select sky and landscapes with great success, and I'm also finding that select subject with pictures of birds against particularly muted backgrounds like this is very useful indeed. So let's make a start. It's not going to be too long and in too much depth and detail. There's numerous other and I'm sure far better YouTube videos to watch than this one, but I hope anyway it will give you a few ideas. Okay, so this is the raw file, and you can see the histogram at the top here is reasonably spread out, and the highlights toward the right hand side. So I exposed to the right as far as I could. It's at 2,000th of a second, ISO 2500 I think. So I exposed it to the far right to get as much detail as I could in the feathers without clipping the highlights. But I could get a little bit further to the right. Let's see how much detail I can get, and to do this I'll click on exposure while at the same time hitting the Alt key, and that will turn the picture black, as you can see, and the white areas start to appear. You can see two little dots in the bottom left of the picture. That tells me they're just clipping. Well, I don't really need to worry about those. They're not extensive enough to worry about, so I'll just bring it back to about here, and that's really as far as I can go exposure wise. But of course, by increasing exposure you also bring in noise into the dark areas, so I can bring that back confidently knowing there is still detail in the whites, but I'm just looking at the black areas now just to hold detail in them. And I think about there is a decent reflection of the bird. Any lighter and it doesn't look true to the bird itself, because it is very dark, its plumage, but of course a very high contrast subject. So I'm going to leave that as is, and now just alter the black and the white points to add a bit of contrast into the picture. Again, I'm hitting the Alt key at the same time as sliding down. I'll bring that to about so, and with the whites, bring the whites up until it starts clipping the snow and back again. So that's as far as I can go with the black and the white points before I start clipping areas extensively. I'm going to bring the black up a little bit. This will give more detail in the darkest part of the bird here. I'm just going to bring that up. You don't, as a rule, have to always bring the blacks and the whites up to their thresholds. It's really just a guide. You should do it by eye, ultimately. I'd like a bit more detail in both the snow and the feathers, the white feathers of the bird here, so I'm going to use highlights, which will bring that back just a touch. That's good. I don't want to go too mad on it because it starts to look false. It's all about subtlety with Lightroom, so let's bring that back to about so. Okay, yep, I'm quite happy with that. Okay, so my next step would either to be to add contrast or clarity, but most likely clarity. Clarity increases contrast in the midtones, and if I do that you can see it working quite nicely here, but how also it affects the background, not just the birds but the background. The background becomes more distracting and sharpened. I really want the contrast. I want all the scene, the background and the snow, to be left, but the birds just to be affected by any adjustments that I make. So this is when I go into the masking tool in Lightroom here, so just click on that and select subject. It will just take a moment to select the subject as best as it can, but what you will find is that it will also keep the center of the image, but that's okay. I can brush that out, no problem at all. So we hit subtract, brush, and you don't have to be very accurate in this. You know, it's really just to take away some of those areas there. I'm not worried if there's if parts of the bird's plumage or its beak or feet here aren't affected, so you can be quite loose with it, as it were. So this is looking pretty good, and you can see here in between the heads of the birds. Let's paint that out as well. Okay, yeah, that's good. And in here by the tail feathers and the wings. So these are the areas I'm painting out that I don't want to be affected by my adjustments that I'm about to make. Okay, that looks pretty good. I can take out the overlay if I want, which I'm going to do, but it doesn't really matter either way really, because as soon as you start using the sliders, the red disappears anyway. So now I'm just going to use clarity here, which will give the birds a nice pop and also add just a sufficient amount of contrast. It's surprising, isn't it, just how much it does. Adds just enough contrast, lifts the highlights, and I found that by experience 20 is just about right for a subject like this. If I go any further it begins to look false. That gives it a nice contrast. Let's bring that back again and you can see how it's just affected the birds and not the background. That's really important to keep the background as clutter free and as muted as possible. So I'm just going to increase that again by 20. And I'm quite happy with that. I'd like a touch more detail in the feathers. There's two ways I can do this. Either I can use the brush or I can use the radial filter, and that's my preference, the latter. So create new mask, radial gradient, that up and angle it up to about here. And I'm not going to use exposure because by doing so you'll see how it also affects the background area. But if I just use highlights, it just affects the lightest part of the bird. So much better to use either shadows or highlights rather than exposure. So let's bring down the highlights. Okay, that looks pretty good. So we're almost there. I'm not worried about more detail in the snow. If I were to add a gradient here and increase the density of the snow, I think it's just going to look false. Something else which I generally do more often than not at the beginning of the edit rather than toward the end is remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. Most lenses, particularly when they're used wide open or stopped right down, will exhibit some vignetting, as you'll see here. So just by clicking that, it does it away. If your lens isn't within Lightroom's profile, then just use the drop down and find the closest one to it, or one that matches your lens. But I'd like to add a small vignette around the image, not one so it looks false or even to an extent where you can tell that I've used it. But if I just use the post-cropping vignette tool here and reduce it by -10, that hasn't really done anything much, so I'm just going to -15, and that's nice. Yeah, that's added a vignette, although you can't tell whether one's been used, and I would say that once you know that one hasn't been used, then you've succeeded. I'm not especially worried about more contrast in the scene itself. I quite like it because of course by adding contrast you're both increasing the whites and the blacks, and by doing so you start to lose detail. So there is always a compromise with a bird that's very, very contrasty. One thing which I might do though is add just a little bit of texture, and this I will do within the mask that I use for the birds. So I'm going to click on there and I'm just going to add 10 of texture, and that'll add a tiniest amount of detail in the feathers, just an additional amount. So I'm quite happy with that, and overall I think I'd like a touch more colour in the background as well, and I prefer to use vibrancy rather than saturation, and I'm just going to use 15 here. And that's just added a touch more colour in the background without it going over the top. And then finally we can go to 100% where I want to add sharpness. You can see here there is quite a bit of grain, pixelation. Well, the ISO is quite high. It's 2500. It's not terribly high for a Nikon D850 that can easily handle up to 6400 as long as it's exposed correctly. So much better for you to use a higher ISO but expose to the extreme right than it is to underexpose the image with a lower ISO. You'll always get much better results that way. So use as high an ISO as is necessary. I needed 0.002 of a second here to stop the motion of the birds, and I've shot with that 200 to 400 lens wide open, so I couldn't have done any more there. And 2500, as I say, is not an exceedingly high amount. If the ISO were higher, or even with this picture, I might consider running it through Topaz denoise, which is an excellent software, but like all softwares that reduce noise, you soften the image marginally and you do lose a little bit of detail, whereas I don't think it's too bad here. I'm quite happy with that. So I want to sharpen the picture, so we go into sharpening, hit the Alt key so it turns it into a black and white. That just makes it easier for you to view the sharpening here, and you can see the eyes and the beak and the feathers just sharpening up a touch, but it also increases the pixel size in the background, and this is where Lightroom's masking is very, very useful indeed. So I'm going to hit Alt again, that'll turn the picture black, or white rather, and use the slider. Now all those areas turning black are not being affected by sharpening, so I can bring that right across to the right hand side. You'll see the only areas that are affected by sharpening are the feathers, or rather the outside of the bird and the beak, etc. There's always a compromise here as well. If I keep going, it's just the outside of the bird, the outline. So I'm going to bring it in to about so, and I think that's a decent compromise. It's detailed where I want it to be. I'm not worried about maximum sharpness in the plumage of the bird, because there isn't really anything, so I can afford actually to go to the right a touch more. So that's as sharp as I'd like to do. And one quick trick before I finish here is to turn the picture upside down. This is a very good trick, very useful trick, which I use, or which I implement in all my editing, and that is when you turn a photograph upside down, you no longer see it as a subject within a frame. You see it as a series of tones, or in this case black and white points. So anything that's way too bright, that affects the balance of the photograph, really does stand out, and I'm quite happy with that. I don't think the birds were either too dark or too light. There's no areas in there which are terribly distracting, so I'm quite happy with how that image is looking, and I think that's just about it. Just to double check what we've done here, applied the mask to the birds where I've just used a bit of clarity and texture. Highlights I've brought down to retain detail in the feathers, but left the shadows where they are. So let's just have a quick look to see if it does anything here. I'm going to leave shadows back where they were, because as I said right at the very beginning, as soon as you start lightening the darkest areas, it increases pixelation, and there could well be the possibility of noise coming into the picture there. So that's it. As you can see, it didn't take terribly long. Rarely do I spend any longer than 3 to 5. No, rarely do I spend this long. I've only spent this long because I'm showing you as a tutorial. But ordinarily, I would have got this done under 5 minutes. But like all things, and particularly with Lightroom and Photoshop, etc., the more you play, the more proficient you become at it. So I do hope you've enjoyed it. There'll be more to come, and thank you for watching.